the troops, the people you lead, the duty that you're performing. I mean, you know, believe me, nobody stays in the military to get rich, okay? Nobody stays in the military and makes a success of it, I think, unless they are really called to do so. Someone once said, you know, you can divide man's work into a calling like a priest, a profession like a doctor, a job, or a career where you go from step to step to step, moving up a ladder of progression, or just a job where you walk in every day and sort of punch a ticket. I find the military is someplace between the calling and the profession. You know, it's something you're identified with. You have a title, like a doctor has a title, and everybody calls you that. And yet you also have to have this inner drive of service. You know, West Point gave us a creed to live by: duty, honor, country. And not everybody that graduates from West Point, of course, lives by that creed for their entire life, but I have. I mean, it just became a way of life for me. The soldier was lying on the ground screaming, and I was afraid that he was going to set off more mines, or worse yet, he had a badly broken leg, and I was afraid that he was going to cut the artery in his leg and die. So I had to go over there and settle him down, and there was nobody else to do it, so I had to walk through the minefield to do it. Believe me, it wasn't a heroic act at that time. It was something that somebody had to do, and I was the guy that was, you know, I was the man in charge, so I was the one that had to do it. You know, heroism is in the eyes of the beholders. It's like beauty. Nobody says on the battlefield, well, I think I will now be a hero and go do a heroic act. You don't do that. It's people doing their job. That's what they're doing. They're doing their job, and somebody else sees them and says, wow, boy, look at that. Isn't that heroic? But the people who are doing it don't think at the time that they're being heroes. They don't think after the fact they're being heroes. They just say, I'm doing my job. Anybody who says they're not afraid in war is either a liar or they're crazy, okay? And there's nothing wrong with fear. I mean, fear is good. Fear will keep you alive in war. Fear keep you alive in business, okay? Nothing wrong with being afraid at all. And everybody should understand that. And fear tends to cause you to focus. It tends to cause your adrenaline to run. It tends to cause you to do things that you know, perhaps to see things in much, much sharper perspective at that instant. What is bad is when you allow that fear to turn into panic, and you allow that fear to petrify you to the point that you cannot perform your whatever duty you have to do. That's the thing that's wrong with fear. But there's nothing wrong with being afraid. And true courage is not being afraid. True courage is being afraid and going ahead and doing your job anyhow. That's what courage is. People need to understand what leadership is all about. Leadership is not managing an organization. Organizations are made up of people. Leadership is motivating people. Leadership is about people. So yes, you got to be competent. There's no question about the fact you have to have competence to be a leader. But you also have to have character. Good leaders are men of competence and character. And many times character is more important than the competence side of the house. So I tell people that the secret to modern leadership is 2 rules. Rule 13, when placed in command, take charge. The leader is the person who's willing to take the responsibility. Now, there's a lot of other people out there that are willing to do the job, but they don't want to get hung with the loss when it happens. So as a leader, you have to be willing to take the responsibility. You have to be willing to take charge. So Rule 13 says, when placed in command, take charge. It's my Schwarzkopf rule system, okay? But that's what it says. But then Rule 14 comes into play, which is very important. Because Rule 14 says, okay, I got it. When placed in command, I take charge. But what do I do? The answer is Rule 14. Do what's right. Do what's right. Because see, we all know, all of us know, basically, when placed in those circumstances, what the moral, what the ethical, what the correct thing to do is. We all know it. So the true modern leader of today is the one that's, number one, willing to take charge and willing to do what's right. That's the secret of leadership. Did you ever try to make a speech about a subject you didn't believe in? It's a lousy speech. I can't make a good speech about something I don't believe in. I've tried, and it's wooden. It comes out. It's not me. You got to believe in what you're doing. If you don't believe in what you're doing, you're not going to do it well. You truly have to believe in it. You have to believe that you're doing what's right. And I don't think I could go to war. I mean, I don't think ultimately I could serve my country if I thought we were doing something wrong. I think I would get out. I would leave. So you don't have to stay. You have an alternative. It's not like the German generals who tried to justify what they did at the Nuremberg trials by saying, I was only doing my duty. That's not right. Because you have higher duties. You have higher duties. You have, you have a duty to your moral code, whatever it might be. So you got to do what's right. Oh, there's a lot of gut instinct that comes into everything you do as a leader. Leadership is an art. It is not a science. It cannot be reduced down to a piece of paper and a bunch of very simple mechanical equations that you'd apply to it and plop out the end, drops the answer, and you just go out and do that. That's not what it's about. So much of it is gut feeling. Some of it's risk-taking. You don't take risks with your troops' lives. I mean, you've got to have your priorities established. You've got to know what you believe in. You have to be well-trained. You have to have confidence in yourself. You have to have confidence in your training. I mean, you get nothing for nothing. It really is. It's hard work, but you got to work hard so that when that time comes when you got to make the tough decision, you're also able to make the decision. Because nothing is more debilitating to an organization than the leader who won't make a decision. I mean, the whole organization just stops and waits, and nothing happens because the leader won't make a decision, and that can paralyze an organization. So you see, Rule 13 again: when placed in command, you must take charge. You got to make a decision. Somebody once said, give me my choice between, what was it? Give me my choice between talent and luck. I'll take luck every single time. And I believe that. I can think of so many times in my career where I came to forks in the road, okay? And I was convinced that I should have gone down this fork, and instead I went down a different fork, and in hindsight, you look back and realize if you'd ever gone down that fork that you thought you should have gone down, you wouldn't be where you were today. So luck is very important. Sure it is. First of all, it was a piecemeal commitment. We dribbled our troops in. One of the principles you learn from studying military history is if you're going to go to war, you don't piecemeal your troops in, because then they get chewed up and spit out in piecemeal. But it was a piecemeal commitment. We dribbled our troops in for years and years. There was always the light at the end of the tunnel. Give us 100,000 more and that sort of thing, and the light never came. Secondly, we didn't use our full military power. We were fighting with one hand tied behind our back. We had this ridiculous situation where the enemy was across the border, and they could attack across the border and do anything they wanted to you, but when you prevailed and went to chase them, you had to stop at the border. Ali Infri, I'm on the other side of the border, you can't chase me. I mean, that's a crazy way to go about fighting a war. We didn't project the power that we had. There's some people that say that our objectives were not clear. I don't know about that, but I certainly feel in hindsight that our war termination criteria were never clear to any of us. So all of that was the wrong way to go about fighting a war. When the first time I came home from the war, I was confused because I had been so intensely involved in this thing called a war, and I came back to the United States and it was like it wasn't going on. It's 1966. And the only families that were involved in the war were people who had loved ones over there. And nobody else seemed to much even know or care that the war was going on. When I came back in 1970, it was different, because now we were being blamed for the war. The military, who were just doing their duty, draftees. I mean, kids that had been drafted in the military and sent to war when they came back home were being blamed by the American people for the war. That's intolerable. I mean, that's terrible. And but a maturation process came about in the American people, because in the Gulf War, you didn't run into that. I think they finally recognized that, hey, the members of the armed services over there are people who are just doing their duty. They're doing their duty because their country asked them to. They're not the ones that caused the war itself. And we got letters over there from people who would say, look, I may not agree with the decisions that put you there, but by golly, now that you're there, I'm supporting you. You've got my support. And then, of course, when I got home, I've run into, I can't tell you how many thousands of Vietnam veterans that have come over and threw their arms around me and just say, thank you, General, for, you made it all right. You vindicated us. It's amazing, but somehow so many of them feel like that they won in the Gulf War. And so that's good stuff. It's good stuff. Many of the parades, the victory parades that were held, included the Vietnam veterans. In my remarks before Congress, I very specifically mentioned the Vietnam veterans and said we were proud to be joining their ranks, because I wanted to make sure that they got the credit for what they had done too. Somebody once said you learn more from negative leadership than you do positive leadership. I believe that. I believe that very much. So I was bound and determined that we weren't going to repeat some of the mistakes that we made in Vietnam. I was bound and determined that if we were going to go to war, we're going to get it over with. We're going to use our full military might. And I would say to you, I'm very proud and very happy that our country, that our administration, that the president on down, the Secretary of Defense, allowed us to do it that way. It's the right. War is never the right thing to do, but if you have to fight a war, there is a right way to fight the war. And that's the way that'll minimize your casualties, save the lives of the people that are out there fighting. Get it over with as fast as you can. I had long since resolved the moral question in my mind. I did it after Vietnam. I did it when I had a choice to either get out of the military or stay in. When I arrived at 20 years, I could have retired at 20 years, and I decided to stay in. So I had resolved the moral dilemma in my mind. Although I will say that, when we were about to go into Grenada, the question flashes across your mind, Grenada, what are we doing here? And are we getting involved in another Vietnam? Are we getting involved in another war that the American people are not going to support? But the Gulf was the same thing. Let me tell you what, the young troops over there were not afraid of the enemy. What they were afraid of is they were going to get involved in another war that the American people weren't going to support. That's what they were afraid of. I've never underestimated the strength of the United States Army, but Grenada certainly brought that point home to me very, very clearly, because in this case, everybody just poo-pooed away the enemy and said they weren't going to fight in Grenada, and they did. And of course, that's best case planning, and all of us learned to do worst case planning, so that's not the way to plan it. I'd been the Commander-in-Chief of Central Command for almost 2 years when the war broke out, and my responsibilities were to conduct any military operations that took place basically in the Horn of Africa, the Middle East, and Southwest Asia. So, you could call it a lucky guess, maybe. But I'd studied the area, and we had come to the conclusion that the worst case scenario that we would have to face would be Iraq. I mean, Iraq had the fourth largest army in the world at that time. They had just won major victories against the Iranians. They had modern military equipment. And so when you looked around at the area and said, who is the worst enemy that you'd have to fight over there? It was Iraq. And so we said, well, what's the worst thing they could do? And that would be sweeping down, and deciding to take over all the oil fields. And so we decided that if that's the worst case scenario, then make sure that we plan to handle the worst case scenario. We can handle any lesser scenarios that might come up. So you might say we made a lucky guess and we were right. The deception tactics of Desert Storm were the ones that I think compare favorably in the Battle of El Alamein, which was the turning point in North Africa in World War II and is considered one of the 3 decisive battles of World War II. The British used deception tactics to make the Germans think that they were going to attack where they weren't. And that's the parallel between Desert Storm and World War II battle. not the tactic itself. Although I can name, gracious, there's any number of campaigns where, in fact, the major portion of the enemy was fixed by one force here while another force went around and hit them like that. And that's sort of what, sort of a classic maneuver if you can get away with it, if you got the forces to do it. My job is to have doubts. My job is to think of everything that could possibly go wrong and then try and fix it. And so, and let's face it, I knew that I was going to be ordering thousands and thousands and thousands of men and women into battle. And if I didn't have it right, I could be responsible for the deaths of thousands and thousands of people. That's sort of a heavy burden to carry. So you don't carry that burden lightly. You don't carry that, say, oh, ho-hum, so what? No, if you ever, to my mind, if you have any sort of a conscience at all, you have doubts, but you work your way through those doubts. You work it in such a way that you're quite sure that you've done everything you can possibly do so that the outcome was a favorable one. I had studied the Iraqis in great detail in their battles against the Iranians. And so I knew what their strengths and weaknesses were. I also knew the forces I had under my command, and I knew what their strengths and weaknesses were. And so what I did was I adopted a campaign plan that capitalized on using our strengths against their weaknesses and avoided their strengths and avoided our weaknesses. And that's a pretty good strategy for any kind of business you're in. Let me give you a good example. I knew that our Air Force was much better than theirs. So I devised a strategy that relied heavily on us conducting an aggressive air campaign because I knew we could take their air out. I knew that they routinely fought during the daytime and resupplied at night. But we fight better at night than we do in the daytime. So I knew I could take the night away from the enemy and totally disrupt the way they normally resupplied themselves and put them in a position where eventually they were going to run out of supplies and they're going to run out of ammunition and everything else because we just took the night away from them. So that's what it was. It's an analysis of your enemy to learn their strengths and weaknesses, and your strengths and weaknesses, and then you just use your strengths against their weaknesses. We put together a campaign plan specifically to make sure that by the time we launched a ground campaign, the Iraqis could not respond. That's what happened. The campaign plan was aimed at absolutely destroying, insofar as possible, the Iraqis' ability to wage war. So that today a lot of people are saying, oh, gee, the Iraqis really weren't there. That's ridiculous. Sure, the Iraqis were there. The Iraqis were there on the 17th of January when we started the air campaign. Now, whether the Iraqis were there on the 24th of February when we launched the ground campaign or not is irrelevant, okay? And a lot of them weren't. We knew there had been mass desertions at that time. We knew that their units were under strength. We knew that we inflicted great casualties on their tanks and their artillery pieces. Why? Because that's what we were going after. We were deliberately trying to eliminate those things that we knew would hurt us on the battlefield. One of my criteria was to reduce the strength of the frontline forces that we had originally run into to below 50%. We generally classify a unit that's below 70% as combat ineffective. So below 50%, it's totally ineffective. And so it's a result. The campaign plan turned out exactly like we had planned it. Okay, it was a campaign plan that had been very carefully constructed to try and make sure that when we finally had to send our ground forces against his ground forces, who outnumbered us originally, that we would prevail. Let's face it, we had tried over and over and over again to bring about a peaceful solution. Secretary General of the United Nations went to Baghdad because that's where that's the only place the peaceful solution was going to come from. Everybody else wanted a peaceful solution. The former Secretary General of the United Nations went to Baghdad. Countless diplomats from east, west, north, south, from the then communist bloc, all went to Baghdad because that's where the peaceful solution had to come from. And it was apparent. Anybody who heard that terrible, terrible news conference after Secretary Baker met with Tariq Aziz in Geneva, where he came out and gave that pessimistic report and said, I'll let the Iraqis speak for themselves. And then Tariq Aziz came out, spoke for 45 minutes, didn't even mention the word Kuwait. I mean, the country had been blotted off the map as far as the Iraqis were concerned, and that was irrevocable. So nothing else was going to change after that. When you looked at other things, like the effects of the weather, some people say we should let the sanctions run a little bit longer. That's very nice to say if you're sitting in the comfort of your living room in the United States of America. What if you were somebody who was in Kuwait and you were seeing your children tortured and your wives raped and the terrible things that were going on to the people in Kuwait? Was it okay to wait for them? See, these things are very, very relative to who you are and where you are. Considering, there's troops that were sitting out in the desert sand. I mean, it may have been fine for everybody else to say we ought to wait, and let the sanctions work, but what about, did we really want to go through another summer with our troops sitting out there in the middle of the absolutely oppressive heat of the desert and just sit there, suffering? Was that all right? Well, their morale was going down, down, down. So when we put it all together, there was no question about the fact that was the time to go and get it over with. Just get it done. We had done everything else we possibly could to do it peacefully. We were able to take the night away from the enemy, and that's probably one of the major ones. But you got to remember, our armed forces have been training for years and years and years to fight outnumbered and win. We thought we were going to be fighting against a military, the Soviet Union, that had many, many more tanks than we did, many, many more armored personnel carriers, many, many more aircraft. So you have a military out there that's very, very well trained to do the job that needed to be done. And so it's a combination of the technology, yes, but it's also the training of the military. It's a very, very good military. As a unified commander, I really answered directly to the Secretary of Defense, and in this case, I really worked directly for the President. Colin Powell was the person that passed to me the directives of the President of the United States. But as a unified commander, you really have tremendous autonomy. You're almost working for yourself. People tell you what to do. They don't tell you how to do it, and then you go off and do it. But Colin and I were good friends, talked to each other on the phone every single day. I kept him informed of everything that I planned to do. In most cases, when an order was to be given, he'd call me up and say, what do you want to do? And I'd say, this is what I want to do, and then that's the order that would come back down again. So we had a very good relationship, as I say, talked to each other every single day. And what was really terrific about Colin is he probably has more access to the White House than any general officer since George Marshall in World War II. Marshall was really the person that Roosevelt looked to for all of his military advice. I think the President did the same thing with Colin, and you could get decisions very, very quickly because Colin did have this direct access to the White House, and that helped us tremendously in our work. I would say he let you do what you wanted so long as he knew what you were doing was right. I don't think I could have done the wrong thing. I think if I had proposed some, things that were stupid or things that were, would lead to thousands and thousands of casualties or something that was immoral and unethical, of course I wouldn't be able to do it. But no, the President was very presidential. The President did exactly what a President does. He told you what to do, gave us our orders, and then he stayed informed all along the way and in great detail as to what it was we were doing, but he did not interfere and decide that he was going to play general, and that's very important. During the Vietnam War, targets that were going to be bombed by the Air Force in North Vietnam were being selected by politicians back in Washington. That's crazy. It's crazy. If you're going to bomb a target or targets, it should be targets that fit in with the overall campaign plan. You do it for a reason, and it should be good, sound military reasons is why you're doing it, not just something that's arbitrarily selected back in Washington, D.C. Nobody controlled the press over there at all. That's an argument that is argued in all of the wrong arenas. It is not a problem of the military versus the media. Don't forget, the people in your military take their oath to support and defend the Constitution of the United States. That's who we take our oath to. And most of the people I know of in the military are constitutionalists from the word go, and that's all of the Constitution to include the First Amendment. You have a management problem. It's a management problem that is growing by leaps and bounds, both numerically and technologically. Let me give you an example. The average number of reporters you had in Vietnam at any given time was 50. During the Tet Offensive, the most important battle probably fought during Vietnam, you had 80 reporters in country. I can assure you all of them were not out with the troops, because those of us who were in cities like Saigon saw plenty of them back there. In the Gulf, you had 2,060. Okay. Secondly, in Vietnam, when somebody saw a battle, it was generally reported and it would end up on television perhaps 36 hours later. In the Gulf, people could report things and they instantaneously out over international airwaves via satellite. And that was being piped directly into the enemy headquarters. So you had people who were reporting things that aided the enemy, that helped them. That helped them. And so there had to be some guidelines put out that said, look, these are things you don't report. But despite that, these guidelines were violated. Not intentionally. Not intentionally. They were violated by reporters that were looking to get a scoop. They wanted to get their story in first. So the dilemma with the press, and any future wars are going to be fought, is how do you control, how is it you control these very, very large numbers of the press that you're going to have over there, who have instant access to the airwaves, and your enemy is going to be monitoring those airwaves? How do you make sure that the press does not provide information that somehow can come back and kill one of the people that you're responsible for? That's the dilemma. Nobody did anything in the Gulf because they didn't like the press. Nobody did anything in the Gulf because they were trying to control the news story. Our only concern, the only reason why any restrictions were placed at all, was to make absolutely sure that, number one, you didn't have 2,060 people sort of running around inside your unit when you were trying to get ready to plan a military operation that you were trying to keep a secret. And number two, a concern for making sure that information didn't go to our enemy. We knew Saddam Hussein watched television in his CP. I mean, we knew that before the war ever started. We knew that. This war was the most extensively covered war in the history of warfare, and that there was access. So that's why I bristle at the word controlled. It sounds like there was some preconceived plot somehow against the media. Matter of fact, we were charged with that. Some people said that there were special courses that had been given at the War College, and that's how Schwarzkopf knew how to deal with the media. That's poppycock. I never took any courses like that. There are other people that charged that at the beginning of the war there was a secret meeting held in the basement of the Pentagon where we decided how the press was going to be manipulated and controlled. That's absolutely not true. Never happened. What we were doing is just using our common sense, and our objective primarily was to make absolutely sure that the enemy didn't get his hands on information that would aid and abet him and eventually cost the lives of our forces. That's all it was. Probably the one that I remember more than anything else is on the second day of the ground war when one of my corps commanders called me up, Gary Luck, and to give me a report. And I said, "How you doing?" And he said, "Sir, we accomplished all of our objectives yesterday. This was about 10 o'clock in the morning. We've already accomplished all of our objectives today. We're way beyond what we should have accomplished, and we have captured over 1,300 of the enemy." Then he kind of stopped, and I said, "Okay, Gary, now give me the bad news, meaning casualty count." He said, "We have 1 wounded in action." It was only then that you began to realize it. But another moment I can remember when we sent that initial wave of aircraft into Iraq. We expected much higher casualties, and my Air Force commander, Chuck Corner, kept calling me back saying, "Sir, they've all come back. They've all come back. They're all coming back." I mean, that was another, it's one of those, the recognition that you weren't taking these casualties that you expected, that they were much lower than that. Those are the 2 moments I'll probably remember more than any others. My father graduated from West Point in 1917, went to World War I, became a captain in World War I. When the war was over, went back to El Paso, Texas, where he was down guarding the border between the United States and Mexico in the cavalry. His father became a cripple in a wheelchair from arthritis deformis. And in those days, a captain in the Army didn't make any money at all, and my dad was an only child, so he became the sole support of his parents. So he had to leave the military. He went back to New Jersey, and it just happened to be at a time when New Jersey had decided that they were going to form a state police, and they were looking for the first superintendent who would organize and lead the New Jersey State Police. I won't go into all the details, but it became a big political struggle. And my dad, in those days, Army officers didn't vote. I mean, it was the commander-in-chief is the commander-in-chief, and therefore it wasn't right to vote for a political party. So Army officers didn't vote at all. And when my dad came back and applied for the job, they said, "What are your credentials?" "I'm a West Point graduate. I have this experience in the military, and I'm a good organizer," and this sort of thing. And they said, "What are your politics?" And he said, "I don't have any. I've never voted in an election in my life." Long story short, he became, at a very, very young age, I think he was 27 or 26 at the time, he organized and formed the New Jersey State Police and was their first superintendent and remained in that job for 15 years. About this time, he got fired because my dad was very much involved in the Lindbergh kidnapping case, which was a very controversial case and has been ever since then. And he also, a political governor came in that he had been an enemy of for quite some time, and this governor did not renew my dad's charter. So after 15 years leading the state police, they said, "Thank you very much, we no longer need your services." About that time, the things were heating up in Europe, and my dad had been active in the National Guard. So when the National Guard got mobilized for World War II, my dad was mobilized with them. And so he returned to the Army on full-time duty, and make a long story short, he finally retired from the Army in 1957 as a Major General. So he had two careers. You see, he had this career as a policeman and his career in the military too. My dad was a man of great honor. He was a charismatic leader. He was one of these people that could tell a story and just had you hanging on the edge of your chair, but always get a great audience around him because he was so good at weaving a tale. And I loved him dearly. And I think the fact that I didn't have him at home for 4 years as a young man made me almost worship this person who was not there, who I so desperately wanted to be there as my father, so that when I was reunited with him, I really almost worshiped the ground he walked on. I think that both of my parents decided it was time the family be reunited. So we went to Iran to be reunited as a family, but then the school system in Iran was terrible. Both of my sisters one of them was a senior in high school and the other was a sophomore in high school, and junior in high school, I'm sorry. And they didn't have a decent school system in Tehran. So after 1 year of living in Tehran, my parents came to the very wise conclusion that our education was suffering. So they shipped us off to Switzerland. So we all went to school in Switzerland for a year. Then my dad was reassigned to Germany. I went to Germany and went to Frankfurt High School for a year, then Heidelberg for a year, and then ended up in Rome. So these wonderful formative teenage years, I spent the whole time abroad in one country after another. I could speak French fluently because in Switzerland, I arrived in Switzerland and did not speak. I'd had 1 year of French and hadn't done very well. And they put me in a room where my roommate was French and didn't want to speak English, sat me at a table with 9 other people that spoke nothing but French. I mean, if you wanted to eat, you'd better learn how to say, "Please pass the bread" in French. And that's a wonderful way to learn a language. When you're young and your mind is so flexible. I was absolutely fluent in French within 6 months. When I was a younger student, I was one of these students that was forever getting these comments on his report card that said he is not working to his potential. He can do much better than what he is doing. I went overseas, and overseas I was more interested in learning by seeing and feeling and hearing and experiencing and that sort of thing. And amazingly enough, I came back to the United States and was a straight A student from there on out. I mean, something clicked somewhere along the way, and I graduated valedictorian of my class in high school, and I was top 10% of my class at West Point without very much work, and got a master's degree in guided missile engineering from USC. Something turned on, and I was never a bookworm. I was always interested more in being well-rounded, and rather than being viewed as perhaps an egghead. Played football, was on the track team, ended up messing around with wrestling, and played soccer in Switzerland. I was on the championship team of Western Switzerland, the junior championship team of Western Switzerland as a fullback. So I did, played tennis, a lot of tennis when I was a young man, and learned how to play. So I mean, but again, I wasn't all-American caliber at the time. It's only when I became general that people look back and said, obviously he was an all-American football player, but it wasn't true. I mean, I was a good athlete. I was a very good high school athlete, but I was certainly not a very good college athlete. Of course, World War II had a tremendous impact on me. It's something that not many people younger than me in the country today remember, but at that time, the entire world was at war. It was a battle between good and evil, and it was a world war. It wasn't a geographically limited war, so everyone was involved. The whole country was involved, and there were fundraisers, but there was rationing, and there were alerts, and you had to go through air raid drills and this sort of thing. That certainly had a major impact upon my life as a young man, and particularly a young boy, particularly since my dad was gone. I mean, to me, this all translated into my father being in some kind of danger. Next to that, there's no question about the fact that the teenage years that I spent abroad had a tremendous impact upon my entire life from that time forth. I mean, I got to know people of so many different nationalities, of so many different cultures, of so many different ethnic backgrounds. And in meeting all of these people of so many different makeups was a wonderful education for me. It taught me that there's more than one way to look at a problem, and they all may be right. You see, so it gave me a certain tolerance, I guess, or not even a tolerance. Maybe tolerance isn't the right word, because tolerance implies that there's intolerance before it. And it's not that, but it just gave me an appreciation for people. Judge them as you find them. Never prejudge anybody based upon any of those things that sometimes people are prejudged. And that's lived with me for the rest of my life. And it gave me the ability to be flexible, to get along with people of all different nationalities. Oh no, I read a lot. I was, the whole Lassie series. Jack London, was one of my favorite people. But then I also read the Iliad and the Odyssey. I was fascinated by by early mythology, and I read the Iliad and the Odyssey several different times. I read when I was a young man. I read Das Kapital by Karl Marx, only because communism was sort of this thing that was looming on the horizon. So I wanted to learn something about it. But I wouldn't say any one particular book. I enjoyed reading. It was fun to read, and I remember we didn't have television those days. So either listen to the radio or you picked up a good book. That was the way you learned. It's funny. People have asked me that over and over again. There was no one. I mean, no one teacher. I always wish I could say, oh, yes, I remember Miss Murphy or something like that, but I can't. There was no one. I can think of several that helped me along the way. At just the right time, they were there to nudge me in the right direction, to get me perhaps to do something at the time I hadn't considered doing. And, it opened up new horizons. But there wasn't just one particular person at all. Probably, if you want to look for one particular person, it was my mom and dad. They were the teachers that really, taught me a great deal. The challenge and the sense of service, perhaps a sense of service more than a challenge. You know that you're serving something beyond yourself. You know that you're never going to get rich in the military. That's not it. You derive the reward from the service itself. You derive the reward from the fact that you are dedicating your life to serving your country. The troops sometimes make it all worthwhile. I mean, they really do. It's great to be with them. Someone once said, when it quits getting fun, you ought to get out. And I say, whoever said that's never been a leader of troops, because I can think a lot of times it wasn't any fun at all. But it's a series of emotional peaks and valleys. And what you hope is that you have more peaks than you do valleys, and you do. And so it's the combination of the fact that you're serving something beyond yourself, and the challenge of leadership when you're leading huge numbers of people. All of that kind of together is why you stay with it. I think it comes from West Point. And my father. My father was a truly selfless public servant, both in his military career and in his police career. He believed very strongly in the motto of West Point, duty, honor, country. I learned the motto of West Point. I learned the principles of duty and honor and country at West Point, and duty was one of the most powerful. Robert E. Lee said duty is the sublimest concept of them all. And it is this sense of duty that drives you sometimes. It's a sense of duty that keeps you going sometimes when things get very, very rough. It's this attitude, well, hey, somebody's got to do it. And if you don't, who will? He lived to see me graduate from West Point. And I can honestly say that was probably the proudest day of his life, I think. But he died shortly thereafter, so he never saw his son really go beyond the rank of lieutenant. When I graduated, I could have gone into any branch of the service I wanted to. I've got to tell you, my father was appalled that I went in the infantry. I mean, absolutely appalled that I picked the infantry. I think he thought I was going to pick the Corps of Engineers or go into the Air Force high tech or something. In those days, when you graduated from West Point, there was no Air Force Academy, so 20% of the class could go in the Air Force if they wanted to. And when I picked the infantry, I tell you what, he never did really understand that. I did not come into the Army to be a lieutenant or a captain or a major. I always thought I was going to be a general. At least I intended to be a general. If I started pumping gas, I would want to be the CEO of Shell Oil, okay? So I always aimed high. My sights were always set very high. I always dreamed of it. I don't really recall, although I do remember in the history of military art, which is a course that I loved at West Point, where you studied old battles and everything else, I admired fellows like Alexander the Great, and Julius Caesar and Napoleon. Not everything about them, certainly, because a lot of them had some very bad characteristics also. But I admired their accomplishments, and Robert E. Lee and Ulysses S. Grant, and right on up the line. And it's funny. You almost admired the more ancient ones more than the modern ones, because the ancient ones you knew not much about except their accomplishments. Hannibal, of course, coming across the Alps with his elephants and defeating the Romans, and the most famous battle of all, the Battle of Cannae, that anybody who's ever studied military history knows, this battle of annihilation, where when it was over, they piled the jewelry up alone from the Romans that had been slain, and it was mountains of jewelry. Any general who's worth his salt cares very much for his troops, very much for his troops. Any general who's worth his salt knows that war is not a Nintendo game. War is not something that's fought by robots. He knows that war is fought, and by soldiers, by people. That liberty is bought by the blood of soldiers and people, and the sacrifices of these people. So I don't know of many generals that are warmongers. There may have been in the past, but in the modern generals that I know are just the opposite. I mean, they will go to extreme steps to avoid war because they know just how bad it is. Let's face it, there's not a general out there today who didn't live through Vietnam, didn't go through the Vietnam experience. In my case, I happened to go through Vietnam experience twice, and also Grenada. And so we know the horrors of war, and I think that probably you will find that that we are greater pacifists than most people you would meet. On the other hand, as I say, you have this sense of duty. And when the time comes when you must go to war, I think we also understand the way to get it over as quickly is to do it as quickly as possible. to bring all of your power to bear and get the darn thing over. And that's another way you save lives. I mean, if war is inevitable and you're going to have to fight it, then the smart way to fight it is to use everything you have, get it over with. Don't let it get long and drawn out. That's why we lost 57,000 people in Vietnam, because that war just dragged on and on and on, and piecemeal commitments and fighting under all sorts of restrictions and that sort of thing. That's not the way to fight a war. I had been in graduate school, getting a master's degree to go back to be an instructor in engineering mechanics at West Point. And I got back to West Point, but the Vietnam War was really, more and more Army officers were being sent over there, at that time mostly to be advisors to the Vietnamese. I was an infantryman. I was not an instructor. I had graduated from West Point to be an infantryman, and I really felt that that's where I belonged. So I volunteered to go to Vietnam, and as luck would have it, I got to go that time. I had a terrific experience over there, very rewarding, very, very self-fulfilling. And probably one of the most self-fulfilling experiences I've ever had, because there was no gain in it for me at all. I mean, I was making tremendous sacrifice for no personal gain, and that somehow can be one of the most self-fulfilling experiences you ever have. I went back to West Point to finish my teaching career and went to Fort Leavenworth and had gotten married in the meantime, but the war was still going on. And I knew that I had learned a great deal in my first tour, and I felt that perhaps because I had learned so much, that I could save some lives by going back the second time. So I volunteered to go back the second time and spent a year over there again. We were stretching out beyond the limits of our artillery, so we had moved our artillery forward, because one of the things that gave us an advantage over the enemy is we did have artillery to support us, and we never wanted to go outside the extreme range of the artillery. And one night, while they were firing the artillery, it just fell short and came in and killed some people in my unit, which is something that does not make you very happy to begin with. I mean, it's a terrible thing when it happens, and it's twice as difficult to explain to the troops, and 3 times as difficult to explain to the families of the troops. And that was the incident. There was one young man that was killed, an outstanding young man, and his parents never really could reconcile themselves to what had happened. They were quite convinced that there was some kind of a cover-up. You know, we had casualties in this war from our own fire. And now we see the same thing all over again, the agony in the family. This war, it's even tougher because there were so few casualties to begin with that anyone who lost a loved one kind of feels cheated because so few people were lost. Why did it have to be my son or my husband or my father? And you certainly understand that. And then when they find out subsequently that they were killed by the fire of their own side, that makes it doubly hard to live with. It's a tragic, tragic situation. If you lead men in battle, I don't care whether you're a sergeant or a second lieutenant or a 4-star general, they're your people. They're your troops. Men and women, I should say, they're your troops. So the loss of every single person that's ever been under my command in battle has always hurt. I mean, even though our losses were so few in the Gulf War, we still suffered losses, and I still grieve for every one of them. I wish we hadn't lost anybody. If you believe something, you should believe it passionately. To be a good leader, I think you have to lead passionately. And I'm a passionate person. I feel very, very strongly about things. I'm an emotional person. And therefore, you know, the tragedy of losing young men and women's lives is tough enough to swallow, and then to find out that it was preventable is even tougher. The area we were in happened to be the same area that My Lai 4 was in the terrible My Lai incident. And I was always convinced on my own mind that the great unanswered question was what the role of the battalion commander had been during that time. He had subsequently been killed, so there was no way you could answer that. But incidents like that are preventable. So anytime we would have a mine incident, and we had an awful lot of them when we first moved into the area because it was a very heavily mined area, and my troops weren't mine-wise. They didn't have the moxie at that time that they later on became, the word street smart, well, they were mind smart after a while. But when we first got there, every time somebody hit a mine, I would always fly in if I was in the area in my helicopter, land right there on the ground, put the casualty on the helicopter, because that got him back to the hospital about a half an hour quicker than they would ordinarily. But the other reason why was to go around and just talk to the troops, because the mines are insidious sort of a thing. They happen. If you're out and you shoot at the enemy and he shoots back at you and you take some casualties, they're not acceptable, but you do understand that at least it was an exchange that caused it to happen. When you're walking along and all of a sudden a mine goes boom, and you see one of your friends killed or lose a leg or something like that, and there's nobody to get even with. I mean, there's no way to retaliate. That tends to fester inside, and so I would go in to try and understand all that. Well, in this one case, we'd had a mine casualty, and I flew in and used my helicopter to medevac them, and I was on the ground. And then, of course, we had another mine casualty, and we were right in the middle of a minefield, and I had to do something about it, and that's what that was all about. The whole world told us we were right. Don't forget there were 40 different countries involved in that coalition in one way or another. And we got letters from all over the world. We started getting 100 tons of mail a day when we first got over there. By the time the holidays rolled around, we were getting 400 tons of mail a day, and almost 100% of that mail was positive, saying you're doing the right thing. I started honing those skills when I was a young man in Europe, and again, I know how to work with people of all nations and all beliefs. But don't forget something else. We all had a common goal. See, we all knew exactly what it was we wanted to do, and that was get Iraq out of Kuwait. So therefore, it was easy to get people to focus on that, on the goal. And when things came up that sort of were not part of the goal, you said, hey, let's put that aside. That really, that may be a problem, but it's not a problem we have to deal with right now. What we need to do is stay focused on the goal. Oh, I had a lot of time to prepare for this, for sure. I mean, let's face it, the sort of the gauntlet was thrown down on the 2nd of August, and we didn't attack until the 17th of January. So that gave me a long time to, it would have been easier if it had been a little bit closer to home. We were about as far away from home as we could possibly be. And therefore, building up the necessary supplies and equipment, getting the troops over there wasn't the easiest thing in the world. I could give you some very, very good arguments why it's in the best interest of the United States and the entire rest of the world for Saddam Hussein to still be there, from a strategic standpoint. Now, from a purely personal emotional standpoint, sure, I'd love it, if he weren't there. But he's irrelevant. And if you were to ask me one of the few mistakes we made in this war, it was to so personalize the war in the form of a guy named Saddam Hussein. Okay, that now some people are looking at and saying, well, gee, we really didn't win because Saddam Hussein is still alive. That's not true at all. I mean, it was a great victory because we did accomplish not only our military objectives, but our strategic objectives. And what's more important today, right now, we have the greatest opportunity for peace in the Middle East we've had in my lifetime, my entire lifetime. I mean, talks are ongoing right now between the Israelis and the Arabs and the Palestinians. You've just seen an incredible outcome in an election in Israel that's going to affect the peace process. And the peace process is ongoing, and all of that is a direct result of the outcome of the Gulf War. It's a direct result of the fact that Iraq is no longer a player over there. They become irrelevant in the politics of the Middle East, and that's important to the world. Character, competence, selfless service, caring about people. Caring about people. I mean, really caring about people. I've known a lot of leaders that said, oh boy, I really care about my troops, and they didn't give a damn when it really got right down to it. But as I say, all of those things, I think, go into the equation of a leader. I said earlier, passionately caring about your cause, whatever it might be. I think that any leader needs an ego. I mean, if you're not confident in yourself, how can you expect anybody else to have confidence in you? So I think any leader has to have confidence in themselves. But it's got to be, I think, one of the most important things about a great leader is this thing called selfless service that I mentioned earlier. In that you're not doing it for yourself. You're not doing it to stroke your ego. You're doing it in spite of yourself. Well, you don't have a private life anymore. That's the bad news. The good news is that you have a wonderful group of grateful Americans out there that come to you every single day, every single hour, every single minute, and tell you that. And so we've talked about this as a family. We've come to a recognition that our lives have changed forever, but we've also come to the recognition that it's for all the right reasons. When you've just signed the 800th autograph and 801 comes up and you've got bad writer's cramp, you just remind yourself that it's because people feel good about their country, they feel good about themselves, they feel good about their armed forces, and when they see you, you've reminded them of that, and that's why they come to you. And then you sign number 801 and go on. You don't say no to them, you say yes to them because it's for all the right reasons. It's one of the terrible things about this country that the minute people become public figures, there's members of the press who do everything they can to start destroying them, to tear them down. I've never quite understood why. You never understand why. And some of the things, many of the things that have been said about me are just blatantly untrue. I mean, some of the stories in the Gulf were manufactured by members of the press, and they wouldn't let go of them. Even when it was proven to them that the story was untrue, they continued to spread it around anyhow, only because they refused to admit that they might be wrong. So I think it's too bad that happens in this country because it keeps an awful lot of good people from serving this country that otherwise would serve this country. But it goes with the territory, and you can't. The important thing is you can't let it get to you. I mean, you've got to, you stay focused on the donut instead of the hole. I honestly could care less what the press says about me. It's important to me what the American people think about me. And the American people come up and tell me over and over again how they feel about me. And if you stay focused on that, and I would also tell you what's very important to me most of all is what my family thinks about me. And my family knows me for what I am and who I am, and that's all that counts. And thank God my kids think I'm a pretty good dad. And that really, as long as they believe that, that's good enough for me. I don't need anything else. I've got a daughter who's 21, another daughter who's 20, a daughter, who's 21 and 20, and then a son who just turned 15. He has not exhibited any interest in the military, and that's okay. One of the things I say to young people is dare to be yourself. I want them to dare to be what they want to be. I don't want to build a box and force them into a mold and make them do something because it will bring them fame or fortune. I want them to do something because it'll make them happy. I think that sons of notorious generals don't stand a chance. Everything that they do well and get credit for, everybody says, oh, well, of course the only reason why they're getting credit is because they're old man Schwarzkopf. And then the minute they stub their toe, everybody says, well, boy, gee, they sure can't fill their dad's footsteps. So, I mean, that puts a terrible burden on a younger person. And I just, as I say, I want my sons and daughters to be what they want to be. I'm my own strongest critic. I probably judge myself stronger than anybody else judged me. I really am my own strongest critic. I'm my own strongest mid-course correctioner. Okay, say, okay, wait a minute, Schwarzkopf, move over here to do that. I'm much tougher on myself than almost anybody else I know. I am much tougher on myself than anybody I know consistently. People who think they're right all the time scare the living daylights out of me. They really do. We all ought to recognize that none of us are infallible. We're all capable of making mistakes, and we all make mistakes, and that's okay because you're human. Okay, what's important is you learn from them. Okay, what's important is you learn from those mistakes. I give a lecture and it goes like this to leaders. I say, how many of you people learn something about how to do your present job by screwing it up the first time? Okay? So you say, my goodness, how can you then possibly say no mistakes of this outfit? How can you not allow yourself mistakes? You're not giving yourself a freedom to fail, because I don't believe in the word failure. You're giving yourself the latitude to learn. I've learned most things I know how to do well probably by screwing it up the first time. The Gulf War was a typical indication of what's happening in the world today. You are not going to see major armies confronting each other along a battle line like you did in World War I, like you did in World War II, like we did in the confrontation between NATO and the Warsaw Pact. What you're going to see is regional conflicts, regional strifes, which tend to get bigger and bigger and suddenly spill over their boundaries and in fact impact the rest of the world, and the rest of the world gets drawn into them. That's the sort of thing you're seeing today in Yugoslavia, the sort of thing you're seeing in the Soviet Union, the former Soviet Union, and that's what we have to guard against. My answer to that is get involved in it while it's still peaceful before it turns into a war, because you don't want to get dragged into these kind of conflicts. But let's face it, when we got involved in the Gulf and the tanker war, when we got involved in the Gulf War that we just completed, it's essentially a regional conflict that got too big and affected the rest of the world, and the rest of the world was dragged in. I don't think it's going to change a lot. No more so than the future of this entire country is going to change. I mean, listen, this entire country since the end of World War II has been our foreign policy has been dominated by what? Confronting communism throughout the world. Our military strategy has been fighting the Soviet Union. Our business strategy has been very much dominated by this thing. Now this is gone. So the central focus, the way of doing business in our government, in our world, in our military, is going to be refocused. And that's going to change, should change a lot of things. But you got to remember, the fundamental mission of the armed forces is going to stay exactly the same, and that's to defend the country. That's what their job is. And we shouldn't get so euphoric that we decide to do away with the armed forces. I can tell you one thing. When I graduated from West Point in 1956, if anybody had come to me and said, General, where do you expect, or Lieutenant, had said, Lieutenant, where do you expect to fight your wars? I doubt very seriously if I would have said, oh, well, it's very clear, I'm going to fight in Vietnam, Grenada, and Iraq. Of course not. You see, so there's a message there. And we don't know where the next war is going to be, and we can't just discount it and say nothing's going to happen, therefore we ought to do away with the military. Well, I think the first thing about serving in the military is you're serving something other than yourself. And that's very important. I think you get a great sense of satisfaction when you serve something above, better than yourself. And that's number one. Number two, it's an exciting career. I mean, I've traveled all over the world, lived all over the world, learned many, many things. So I've enjoyed it from the excitement of world travel and the adventures that I've had. I've had all sorts of wonderful adventures. And I've met some wonderful people, and I'm associated with great people. And people that have been very, very close to me in the past and will be for the rest of my life, I've met in the military. So all that. I enjoyed my military career. My family enjoyed my military career. Women are very much a part of the military. They're very much a part of the Gulf, and they already are integrated into the armed forces to a great extent. The big conflict now is over the role of women in combat. This is another one of these questions that's being argued in the wrong arena. It's being argued in the arena of equal rights, and that's not the arena it should be argued in. It should be argued in the arena of national defense and what's best for the defense of this country. I talk about the problem this way. I say, listen, take an armed forces that has a unit of 1,000 infantrymen. These are the folks that fight with bayonets and roll around in the mud and the trenches. Okay? Now oppose them with an organization of 1,000 people, 50% of whom are female. Is that really in the best interest of that second country to send that organization against an organization of 1,000 men with knives to fight in the trenches? I don't think there's anybody in the world that would agree that that makes sense. Some might. So what I'm saying is the decisions that need to be made in this realm are decisions which say we must do what's in the best interest of this nation for the defense of this nation. At the same time, we must do everything we can to make sure that women in the military have the same opportunity that men in the military have to get ahead. But it's got to be a balanced approach and not one that just blindly says 50% of the entire military must be female for no other reason than because 50% must be female. That's not the way to handle the problem. Now, having said all of that, I got to tell you what, the women in the Gulf did a magnificent job. They had it much tougher than the men because of the cultural sensitivities, and yet they handled it with ease, and they did an absolutely fantastic job, and I am very much in favor of women in the military. I happen to be one of those people that's in favor of women in the cockpit. I have no problem with women in flying a fighter plane. I mean, if they're going to fly medevac helicopters, you know, in the heat of battle, why can't they fly in an Apache helicopter? So now I would tell you that that's not shared by, you know, many of my friends in the military, but I happen to be one of those people that's in favor of women in the cockpit. And the armed forces, you know, dealt with race before the entire rest of this country did. Today in the armed forces, racism and prejudice has essentially been eliminated. All you have to do is go out and look at the number of black soldiers you have in the military who are there because they feel that they have a far better opportunity for advancement in the military than they do anyplace else. The proportion is much greater than you find anyplace else. Colin Powell, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, happens to be the highest ranking man in the entire U.S. military, happens to be a black soldier. I don't even look at soldiers as being black, white, red, yellow, green, purple, or pink, and most of my friends don't. But I'll tell you one thing, if we ever run into anybody who does, we get rid of them. We don't tolerate intolerance in the military. So and I don't know of anybody who really, there are a few people who don't agree with that. None of them, by the way, happen to be in the military or know very much about it. They just keep talking about it for their own purposes. But I got to tell you what, that we just don't tolerate prejudice in the military at all. And I'll tell you what, another thing, we have been going after sexual harassment in the military long before the civilian world even discovered what the term was. We came to grips with this many years ago when we started bringing more and more women in the military and found out that they were in fact being harassed. And we have been dealing with that for quite some time in the military in a much stronger way than I think our civilian contemporaries have. Drug problems almost eliminated in the military, and I'll tell you why. It's a thing called random urinalysis, random testing. We have a unique situation in the military now where people want to be there. It's an all-volunteer force. By the way, that's one of the interesting things about the Gulf War, is the fact that 100% of all the people there volunteered. They either volunteered to be in the active force, the National Guard, or the reserves. But everybody wants to be in the military there today, and they don't want to be kicked out. And we've made it very clear that we conduct random testing, and that if a person comes up positive on random testing, they're kicked out of the military. It's just that simple. We don't tolerate drugs in the military today. So we have cleaned it up, and you know, and all the information we have, all the surveys we have, and everything else show that we're a lot cleaner in the military than we ever have been.
Looking back on...
By the way, the same thing happens to apply to alcohol.
Say that again.
The same thing happens to apply to alcohol. It used to be that, we would, drunkenness and DUIs and things like this were tolerated. They're not tolerated anymore. If you want to get in trouble in your military career, just come up with one DUI, just one DUI. And it's considered a very, very serious offense and grounds for elimination. It's not a perfect world. When I graduated from West Point, I saw things very much in shades of black and white. And I've come to understand that, and I also was, I demanded a great deal of myself then as a young man, in shades of black and white. I mean, you had to do everything right. You couldn't do anything wrong. And that's not what life's all about. And, but I guess the thing I've probably learned more than anything else is self-fulfillment is the most important thing of all. Being happy with what you do, feeling good about what you're doing is probably the great secret to life. You don't measure a person's success by what they take out of life. You measure a person's success by what they leave behind. So, you can have all the money in the world, you can have all the power in the world, you can have all the prestige in the world. None of that's important. What's important is what you do with it when you have it. That's what's important, and that's what leadership is sort of all about. Trust yourself. Life's worth living. Life is worth living, and life should be lived. Okay? There's more good out there than there is evil. Man is basically good. Mankind is basically good. I guess 30 years from now you'd say person kind. I don't know. But what I'm saying is people are good. People are great. Enjoy them, and enjoy your life. And again, it's the point I would make to any young people. It's what I talk about my children. I want people should dare to be themselves. Don't be something because somebody else tells you that's what you should be. Don't be a brain surgeon, okay, if you want to be an artist. You'll never make any money as an artist. You could make a fortune as a brain surgeon, but don't be a brain surgeon to make money. If you want to be a brain surgeon because you're really interested in saving people's lives, that's the reason to be a brain surgeon. But most of all, be yourself. Dare to be yourself. Take your God-given talent and use it the way you feel you should use it. Don't let anybody steer you down a path of this way you'll get more money, this way you'll get more prestige, this way you'll get more success. Because I've seen so many people in my lifetime who burn out. They get all of these things that they originally strive for, and then there isn't anything else. So what do I do now? Okay? Because the one thing they don't have, you see, is it's not here. It's not in their heart. They don't have self-fulfillment. They don't feel good about themselves. They don't feel satisfied because they measure their lives in terms of the next promotion or the next award or the next pay raise or whatever it is. One of these days, all that's over with. The most fulfilling times I've had were times when I was doing my duty with no personal gain towards myself. I mean, I got nothing from it. And yet I got everything from it. That's the point. I got nothing tangible from it, but I got everything from it. Man does not get to write his own epitaph. But if I were to write mine, it would say the following. He loved his family and he loved his troops, and they loved him. Period.